Hi, this is Matt with State of Flux, here to give you a review of Spider-Man in the MCU. That's right, I'm going to be talking about each of his 5 featured appearances in the Marvel Cinematic Universe films. I won't talk about the What If. This is all in preparation for his 6th entry, which comes out later this week, so stay tuned for a review from that. How did Spider-Man come into the MCU? They wanted him as early as the first Iron Man movie. There's a deleted scene where Nick Fury even name-checks him in that. But it wasn't meant to be, because the studios couldn't get along. So, Sony went on making their Spider-Man movies, and with The Amazing Spider-Man 2's rather horrific performance, and in terms of critical, fan, and it's kind of a weaker tiered, overall performance worldwide, it was time for Sony to strike a deal, and they did, after Kevin Feige reached out explaining what his thoughts were for how they could fix Spider-Man. And you can research this on your own, and a lot of this involves the Sony hack, but what it led to was Spider-Man's inclusion into Captain America Civil War. Now, there were multiple scripts. There was a time period for Civil War where it was only going to be Captain America, and he was going to be continuing on his sort of story as set up from Winter Soldier. And then there was drafts written where Downey would have been involved as Iron Man. And the movie we got was that. Once that was solidified, and it was definitely going to be Civil War, there was 2 drafts of the script written. One that included Spider-Man, and one that did not include Spider-Man. Joss Whedon even wanted to include Spider-Man in the tag for the Avengers Age of Ultron. He wanted either Spider-Man to make a cameo or Captain Marvel, both of which were shot down, but they did film a Captain Marvel version with an alternative actress in the role. My thoughts on Civil War are going to be brief, because I'm going to address each of these films only in the usage of Spider-Man, not necessarily to the features as a whole, and because of that I'm not going to give graded ratings to the 2 Avenger films nor Captain America, but I will give a full review for Homecoming and Far From Home. Alright, so Civil War. We got the backstory. Spider-Man was included, and in his initial scene, the introductory scene, the chapter would be called Queens, you get everything you need to know about Spider-Man as a character. Beautifully written in probably 5 pages of screenplay. Laid out in front of you that is stronger in content, in theme, and in quality of performance even, than we have seen in Spider-Man movies since Spider-Man 2. The first Spider-Man 2, that is. His being woven into the MCU was very, kind of almost haphazardly done. There's a throwaway line in Ant-Man that discusses a wall crawler. And then Tony Stark just happens to know of this kid. But the scene itself in question, Queens, is just so well written. It's a beautiful introduction into Peter Parker, who's just a slight bit of a dweeb, but an overall just good-natured kid who wants to do the right thing. And it's so well executed. The performance by Tom Holland as this kid, he won me over in like 30 seconds. I was completely blown away. And his being able to switch from comedy, often at his expense, to then suddenly having the rich pathos, and the scene where he's like, when Tony asks him, why do you do this? Why do you cover up the face? And he's like, because when the bad things happen, I have to be able to protect those that I care about. And if they know who I am, then they're going to know who they are. And it's all without having to say anything about Uncle Ben. You know that that is there, and you bring that with you to that performance. And it's so strong. And if this is your first introduction to Spider-Man ever, it still works because you know that something bad happened to somebody around him, and you can probably infer that because he's living with his aunt, that it's either something happened to his parents or his uncle. It's brilliant. And the way he plays off of Robert Downey Jr., I think Downey has a gift of pulling excellent performance out of the people he's acting opposite of because they want to match him, and he's so good and charismatic that it just really works. That scene completely defines and shapes every one of these movies moving forward because of how well they establish that one scene in the movie. It's perfect. Skip ahead a little bit, we see him involved in the fight, and his inclusion in the fight where he steals Cap's shield, and he's holding it there, and his costume looks just peak Steve Ditko from the very initial run of Spider-Man comics. It's just, everything about it was perfect, outside of the fact that it's very obviously digital, which is my only real complaint about, in fact, all of these ones. So yeah, I think how they utilized him there, moving and stuff like that, his inclusion in the action of that film is really quite good. You see him just kind of following orders and stuff like that, which is unusual. It's a different presentation of Spider-Man that had ever come before, which also has kind of helped with the freshness of it. And then you have one more beautiful moment with Peter Parker, where he and Cap are going at it. He's battling Captain America. And Cap is like, "What did Tony tell you about me?" And then he rises to that question and says, "He told me that that you think you're right, and that makes you dangerous." And that scene that they share is great because it informs his character as well. He's talking to Captain America, who's the pillar of virtue in the MCU. And in that, he's talking about his own virtues, the concept of right, and the dangers that can fall when a person that isn't necessarily right, but they believe that they are. And that informs Cap as to who Parker is. And I like that moment because it's immediately followed by a moment of shared mutual respect. Cap drops the thing on him, Spider-Man has to catch it and is holding it with all of his weight. And he's like, "You got a lot of heart, kid. Where are you from?" And then he's like, "Queens!" And then Cap sort of smiles, laughs, nods, and he says he's from Brooklyn. And then off he goes. It's beautiful. Everything about that is great. That is one of the best moments of character. You get informed of his character through the use of Tony and Cap, where he rises to the qualities that both of them share, that they establish as virtues worth perpetrating and pushing forward. And so I really liked it. He's great. Then he's in the very end of the post-credit sequence of Civil War, and it's good. It's like a little tease or whatever. Seeing him in this movie, Civil War, got me excited for another Spider-Man movie, which my interest had been tapering for the past couple films. So there's that. Moving on to Spider-Man Homecoming. This is a good movie. I like the teenage feel. This is the first time you really capture the feel of what it is to be a teen going to school. A lot of people get hung up on the fact that Peter Parker should be always in school, but the truth is, and I think I addressed this when I reviewed the Raimi movies, is that he was only in school for about 40 some odd issues of the comics. After which point, he spent his entire career outside of the comic, or outside of a high school setting and in college settings or in work settings. So the necessity to have the kid in high school wasn't necessarily there for me. And to keep going back into it, I was a little nervous with Homecoming that we were moving back into that territory yet again. Because at this point, we'd already seen 3 feature films with him in high school. So I wasn't really keen on that. But what they bring to this is an authentic feel of high school, of how your relationship is with your friends, being the dweeby kid. I think his Peter Parker is probably the most relatable in that he's a good-natured dweeb. And he's not necessarily like the cool outcast dweeb that you got with Andrew Garfield, and he's not just like the wholesome Peter Parker from the Raimi movies. This one's a little more contemporary, a little more relatable, and I think it really works. And I think it's a good melding of the Ultimates version of Spider-Man and the original incarnation of Spider-Man from the Amazing Comics. I think they captured the tone of that really well. I also like that we didn't have a Mary Jane Watson or a Gwen Stacy, or essentially the exact same character. You had Liz Allen, who is another character that's very important to the Spider-Man comics that had never really been addressed before feature film-wise in any meaningful way. So that was kind of cool, as well as being one of his early relationships in the comics. And I like how they tied it into the MCU as a whole. You have Peter Parker wanting to be an Avenger or whatever, so there's a lot of callbacks to the Avenger world, but then you have a villain who's been slighted by the Avengers, and he also wants to just be like your friendly neighborhood villain. He isn't going for a global catastrophe thing, as we've seen in previous Spider movies, or MCU movies for that matter. We have something that's a little more ground level. It felt a little more like the Daredevil TV show that Netflix had put out, in that sense of how somebody slighted by the Avengers, or being an opportunist, capitalizing off of what the Avengers did in New York. All that really works well with Homecoming. One of the other things that I thought was unique and fresh with Spider-Man Homecoming was the fact that we've spent 5 previous feature-length films with Spider-Man actively trying to not be Spider-Man. In the first one, he wants to be Spider-Man until his Uncle Ben dies, and then he sort of sees it's his responsibility to be Spider-Man. He spends the whole second movie wanting to give that up, and the third movie priding himself on being Spider-Man until he realizes the darkness that that can bring. And then you have the 2 Amazing Spider-Man movies where he doesn't want to be Spider-Man. This is the first one where he spends the entire length of the feature film wanting to be Spider-Man and actively trying to be Spider-Man the whole time, trying to prove his worth. It was nice, it was fresh, and I loved that aspect of the film. I do think it gets a little top-heavy in all of the references to all the Avenger movies and stuff like that, but these are high school kids, and in a real world where you have real-life heroes out there, it makes sense that kids would probably be obsessing over and talking about them like we do now. Like, if you ever go to a place where there's any kind of cinephiles that enjoy these kind of mass market movies, the endless conversations you can have about Iron Man and all this kind of stuff, really, you feel the weight of it. So that added an extra layer of reality. I think they do go a little too heavy into it. The performing people around him are quite good. I really like Ned. He's a nice standout. The actress playing Liz Allen is very lovely and very good in the film. But it's really Michael Keaton that helps to elevate the hell out of that movie. Michael Keaton is exceptionally good actor. So much so that he's definitely probably above this movie or this kind of movie. But I like that he's willing to embrace it every once in a while. And I love the scene in the car. That is possibly one of the best scenes in the MCU, of when Spider-Man realizes who the Vulture is at being Liz's dad, and when the Vulture, the moment he realizes that Peter Parker is Spider-Man and they become a threat with each other. It's a beautiful showdown, and it's haunting, absolutely horrifying, and I love it. So yeah, that scene is spectacular. The biggest complaint I have with the movie is the first half of Spider-Man Homecoming is a little disjointed, or it's not. It's trying to find its footing of the type of movie it's trying to be. That scene in question is the turn where the whole rest of the movie is like perfect. But the other big issue I have with the movie is cinematically is the least interesting looking Spider-Man movie, even worse than the two Amazing Spider-Man films. I've talked at length about the excellent visual quality that Sam Raimi brought to the original trilogy, all three of them. The look of Spider-Man Homecoming is pretty unimpressive. Especially the action is just not shot well or in an engaging way at all. But it counterbalances that with an excellent use of color palette. The uses of red, blue, green, and blue. Those are really the only colors featured in the film prominently. And how they kind of juxtapose each other, and how the reds are so red and in conflict with the greens of the Vulture. That really works for me, and that I thought was a strong element of the film. But I think it is a very good Spider-Man movie, certainly a step up from the previous two entries, really three entries, I guess. So I would give Spider-Man Homecoming 3.5 out of 4. And the title is brilliant. The title tells you everything you need to know, which is that Spider-Man is coming home, where he should have been the whole time in the MCU. It's a beautiful slight, and it's noticeable, but it's not in your face. And it's pretty great. I didn't talk about Robert Downey Jr. and his relationship with Peter Parker in the Spider-Man Homecoming, because I kind of want to save it for the two Avenger films. So, there's an excellent moment on the rooftop in Spider-Man Homecoming where he confronts Peter Parker, having done his like visual quote to Spider-Man 2, holding the ship together, trying to keep his world from falling apart literally, and Iron Man has to come in there and put it back together, and that's where he reprimands him, and he's like, if you're nothing without the suit, then you shouldn't have it. And then he continues on, and he tells Peter that if anything were to ever happen to him, then that's on his conscience. That's on him. Which is something that strikes home with Peter, because he feels the exact same way about Uncle Ben. Even though you don't have to say it in the film, we all know it, and it's there. And they bring this scene beautifully to life with the next two films. Spider-Man ends that movie rejecting being an Avenger and embracing being Spider-Man, even if it's on a friendly neighborhood kind of way. But makes it known that he'll always be there if Iron Man ever were to need him. Well, then Thanos comes, and Peter gets involved, and he wants to be there to help solve this problem. And he is used wonderfully as the comic relief, but also being the smart kid who kind of can outsmart these villains just by using film tropes that he knows. And I thought that was kind of fun. But he brings a lot of pathos to the end of the film, where Thanos wins, he snaps, and along with many other Avengers, Parker gets dusted into the wind. And because he has his spider sense, he feels it coming, and he's like, no, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I don't want to go, I'm sorry. And then he wisps away, leaving Stark with the blood on his hands of this boy. And that is kind of his motivating factor. He lost. He knows he lost. He comes back and has this cathartic moment with Captain America as resolution to what happened between Cap and Iron Man in Civil War. And this first thing when they reconnect is, I lost the kid. And he learns how to live life by moving on. He becomes the thing he always wanted to be. He lives his life after the end of the world. And it's kind of beautiful. But the one thing that he can't get over is how he feels responsible for Peter. So the end game happens, and it comes down to another snap. And when Peter shows up at the end of that movie, it is so powerful. The music just rises perfectly right when he jumps into the frame and stands heroically. It is absolutely beautiful, and then he's one of the people that gets to carry the gauntlet a good chunk of the way, and they call back to the instant kill mode, and there's just so many great moments. I love the callback to Homecoming, where Downey's reaching across him to open the door, and Peter thinks he's trying to hug him, so he hugs him, and then Downey's like, nope, we're not there yet. He gets out of the car and goes. Cut to this movie, Peter runs into Iron Man and sees him, and he's like, oh my god, this is happening, and this and this, and Downey just shuts him up and hugs him and embraces him, and you feel that emotion on Downey, and then Peter being like, oh, I guess we're here now. Like, that's kind of awesome. And then the last snap happens, and Thanos, in a beautiful shot, sits down exactly as he did triumphantly at the end of Infinity War, where he got to look on at his grateful universe, and he sits down one last time in Endgame, the exact same shot, the same way, sitting down to look at a grateful universe as he gets whisked away. And then smash cut to Tony, who is dying, Peter being one of the first ones there to embrace him. He's like, we did it, Mr. Stark, we did it. And then, realizing what's about to happen, he starts crying, and he backs away and gives Gwyneth her moment to shine. And then we see Peter at the funeral. And so Spider-Man's use, even though it's not a ton of screen time, is so strong in these two films. It's breathtaking, the amount of character work that they're able to do with very little screen time. All because of an exceptional moment in Civil War, where the two meet for the first time. Moving on to Spider-Man Far From Home. The whole film is weighted on the fact that Spider-Man feels the weight of responsibility in how he gets those around him in danger and can die because of who he is. Iron Man has the exact same thing. After the death of Peter Parker, Iron Man feels that weight of responsibility. And he creates the scenario wherein he snaps everybody back to life at the expense of himself, and who feels the responsibility and the weight of that is the boy he did it for. And this film is about him coming to terms with the weight of responsibility. And I loved that aspect of the film, and how the whole movie concerns itself kind of weirdly with who's going to be the next Iron Man, which is kind of the same story that Iron Man 2 was doing. Iron Man 2 was all about legacy. He wanted to preserve his legacy, and he didn't necessarily know how, and he had to turn to his deceased father to really kind of embrace how that could come to pass. It's weird for a second movie and an installment to be about legacy, but that same storyline kind of gets mirrored here. It's done a little bit better, but it falls to a lot of the same pitfalls, though. I will say that the first hour of this movie also feels pretty disjointed. I will say that the camera work was elevated quite a bit, which is a big step up from Homecoming. It is much more visually interesting of a movie with kind of a weaker color palette, which is a little disappointing. But that said, it's when Mysterio reveals himself to be the villain that we know him to be. Excellently played by Jake Gyllenhaal, who looks at peak attractiveness in this movie. Like, it's distracting how good looking he is in this film. And Mysterio is one of my favorite comic book characters, and nobody gives him the respect he deserves. He's awesome, and I loved his use in this movie. Make him the hero, then make him the villain. It's brilliant, and it's such a good misdirect, and so in character. Sure, he's not an actor like he was in the, or a special effects artist like he was in the comics, but it doesn't matter. He's still captured perfectly, and he looks great, and the moment that we see the bubble head, I geeked out. That said, his turn when he reveals himself as trying to just be the one to get the glasses, that heel turn is so perfect, and the whole rest of the movie is exceptional. The particular highlights are when Mysterio is being Mysterio and immersing Peter in this world where you have no idea what's real and what's not and stuff, and I'm still not convinced that Mysterio isn't alive at the end of this film. It's great, and if I were a betting man, No Way Home, we might see a resurgence of Mysterio, or he might be the sixth of the Sinister Six that movie looks to be promising us. But who's to say? I guess I will find out in days. So anyway, the use of Happy Hogan in this movie is great. I like when the moment that he has on the plane where he sees Peter just being Peter and how he is really just truly the embodiment of what Tony represented, and that Tony's presence will always be felt in this kid, and that's why it's so important that he stay in the MCU, and I hope we have several more MCU movies with him in it. He is Tony's legacy. I like the stuff with Aunt May, she's great. I like the stuff with Zendaya, who's MJ. That was kind of a twist at the end of this one that kind of worked as well as like the Robin twist at the end of Dark Knight Rises. But I like her character a lot, especially in this movie when she is allowed to be a character and she is an active presence in the end of the film, which is a nice twist from the previous 5 damsel in distressy things that we saw with the Raimi Webb films. So that was a step up. Ned is great. I love Augury Rice, who plays Betty Brant. She's great in this movie as well. She's like an unsung gem of the film. I like what they did with Flash Thompson. You kind of feel weirdly sad for him. This movie is probably the weakest of his MCU appearances, but there's so much that works, and the action is so good, especially in that last ending. The last hour of this movie is like damn near perfect, and the first hour of that movie is so kind of meh, which is disappointing. But I do like this movie. It's a very strong 3-star film. Yeah, that's my thoughts of Spider-Man in the MCU. He is Tony's legacy, while also being his own significant character. He is put to perfect use, and I cannot wait to see what happens with No Way Home. Let me know what your favorite Spidey appearance was in this. I was going to address Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, but I think I'm going to hold off on that until Across the Spider-Verse comes out in a few months' time. So stay tuned for that. Stay tuned for my review for No Way Home. Should be up on Friday, Saturday. We'll see what happens. Thanks for watching. And yeah, as I said, let me know what was your favorite use of Spider-Man. Who is your favorite Spider-Man? Do you go with Maguire? Do you go with Garfield, or do you go with Holland? For my money, Holland is the best Spider-Man Peter Parker immersion. I think that Garfield was a really good Spider-Man, bad Peter Parker, and I think that Tobey Maguire was good in both, but really sold the Peter Parker side of the character. A little less so with the Spider-Man. Holland seems to have hit that perfect balance. Ding the bell, like, subscribe, and thanks for watching. Peace!